clerk's desk?
Yep.
Takes a while to get this thing.
That's fine. It'll give me a chance to
Yeah,
get
gotcha.
in here.
This for the file. This for the file. Yeah, I'll put them all together.
Mr. Veo, you want the memos up as well, or just the, come up here. What do you want me to show? Do you want the memos?
If you look at the third email down,
Third email down.
yep, that has the link. That's all. I just, if you want it as
That's what you
visual aid,
want.
it's there.
I don't need the two memos.
I'm gonna hand it to you then.
Fine. All right, so I will minimize this. I will get out of that.
I have ear block and I can't talk. Other than that, I'm fine. Straight across from beef gyro. Beef Texas
All right.
gyro. I'm kind of like a dog. I just eat anything. I have no standards. No, everything's good. That's one major if you ask me. I like it.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. How are you doing tonight? Welcome to Open System Live. I'm assuming you're here for testing. Good. Did you get over? Yes. Good. All right. So, is anybody from your group, are you planning on speaking this evening? Would you like to address the committee? Or is Alderman Lopez going to represent you in your minutes?
Oh, feel free to speak.
Are they speaking, Tom, or?
I encourage everybody for public comment.
So at the beginning of the meeting, what I'll do is I will allow public comment. So if you would like to make a statement about a piece of legislation that we're considering this evening, you can approach the microphone, you can state your name and address, and then make your comments. And we'll listen to it. We won't respond to any questions, but we'll take note of what you, the points that you make. And then when we bring the legislation up to consider this evening, that's when we'll take into all of your input and speak to those questions. Okay? Any questions? Yeah? All right. Tom, I tried to stick around. I was trying to see if you needed a ride to over here.
Oh, yeah. I didn't even see you there.
I was standing in the-
That would have made way more sense than what I did.
I was standing in the back in the dark, and you had lights in your eyes.
Yeah, and I mean, even in the best of times, they're kind of iffy, so, yeah.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, let's go ahead and kick that on.
Okay.
Good evening. A meeting for the Committee on Infrastructure will be called to order on this evening, Wednesday, September 27th at 7:06 PM. Would the clerk be so kind as to call the roll?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Alderman at Large Mark S. Cookson.
Present.
Alderman David Shoneman. Here. Alderman Tom Lopez.
Here.
Alderman Sean McGinnis, I'm here, and Alderman Richard A. Dowd.
Present.
Also in attendance this evening, we have City Clerk Patricia Piazzu. We have Director of Economic Development, Director Cummings, and Downtown Specialist, Mr. Veo. Did I miss anybody?
I don't think so.
Wonderful. So we will begin with public comment. If you have a comment that you would like to make to the committee, I would ask that you please come forward. And I know that Mr. Cutter is going to, sure, Mr. Cutter, if you'd like to have a seat, please.
Jim Keller, 86 Palm Street, Kansas City. Letter to Alderman Cookson. Dear Alderman Cookson, when the Nashua Building Inspector approved the 1971 building permit for the Gilbertsons, that violated the 1949 plat ordinance. It became a matter between the city and the Gilbertsons. The permit gave birth to violations of RSA 635:2, criminal trespass, RSA 627:9, number 1, curtilage, RSA 31:102, obstructing access to highways, and Nashua Ordinance 190-193, land use ordinance, where driveways must be at least 9 feet wide. Part of that permit was a scam by Genevieve Karen, prior owner of 88 Palm Street, who convinced the Gilbertsons there was a gap in the 86 Palm Street deed that took a 3-foot width, a third of our driveway. Genevieve Karen passed away in 1980. A gap never existed. The approved 1950 building permit for Leo Karen was the proof Genevieve needed to convince the Gilbertsons of the gap. More or less, quote unquote, is used 4 times in our deed to show no one would use that term to prove there was a gap. I have attached book, well, the 2 deeds, one for Droja and one for my family. And if you look at them, this is kind of a bit of a surprise to me that the body of the deed is the very same as the very first one. No matter how many deeds are written up, it's always the same unless there's a survey done or something like that to change it. The real estate for sale sign for 88 Palm Street was installed on August 15th. And we are not going to allow the Gilbertsons to sell their property until they have removed their fence, etc. Sincerely, Jim. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cutter.
Yes. I'd like to say if you could put a rush on it. But anyway, you know what I mean.
Yes,
Thank you
sir.
very much.
Thank you, Mr. Cutter. Any additional public comment this evening? Please come to the microphone. State your name and address, please.
My name is Christopher Dion, and I'm from 6B Belmont Street, Nashua, New Hampshire. I'm here today to represent my little community. We are a handful of people that rent from a wonderful couple. We have a limited amount of parking spaces, and we have even less ways to get to them. There are situations between our handful where communication isn't perfect. Someone may park in a place that creates a situation where you can't get by to your parking spot, and it's no fault of them, aside from maybe a little bit of carelessness when placing their vehicle. This is an extremely stressful situation that I deal with quite frequently. I have a far back parking spot, and that's fine. But again, the handful of tenants, and there's only a small amount of them here tonight. I'm not sure what the rest are doing. They obviously don't feel as passionate as me about it. Um, So yeah, I'm here today to try to illustrate my stress and aggravation while also trying to be friendly with all of my tenants that I live with and have to coexist with in that wonderful Belmont Street. Yeah, so that's all I got.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Dion. Any additional public comment this evening? Your name and address, please.
My name is Raymond Boucher, 4.5B Belmont Street. We've had an issue with the parking. There's other streets around us that have limited parking as well. I think it's Ash Street and there's 2 streets adjacent to ours that everybody gets to park on the road and nobody gets a ticket. We park on our brand-new road right by the bank, Bank of New England, and we get tickets every night. And there's plenty of place to pass. We're all pretty respectful, and we pull our vehicles in snow emergencies and snow times. We pull them out to have our plow guys get in, and then we get the heck out of the way. There's been a few people that have parked there that worked for the city that actually did not get tickets. My major gripe is getting a parking ticket if I pull my vehicle in, and there's plenty of room to park. It's a brand-new street and plenty of room to get by. Fire trucks go down there, police vehicles go down the wrong way. That's not what my gripe is, but we'd just like to have free parking. Look at the other streets adjacent to us that have parking on both sides, and the plows can't get through. So when I'm going to work in the morning, I can't get through. It's like white knuckling it. So check that out. That's pretty much what I have to say, and thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Boucher. Any additional public comment? Good evening.
Sean Wren, 6A Belmont Street. As far as the parking on the street goes, for my job personally, I do a lot of traveling, so I rent a lot of vehicles. And with the limited parking, it's usually difficult to coordinate getting my personal vehicle somewhere to be there for a week or 2 at a time while I have my rental vehicle. So I know a big concern is potentially having parked cars being in the way when school's getting in and getting out, because that road does get pretty crowded with a lot of parents coming through, a lot of buses coming through. But I feel like if you keep the current 2-hour parking limits and only allow overnight parking from 6 to 6, I don't think that would become an issue. I know for me personally, I'm up and out real early, so I would never be interfering with any traffic coming through for school pickups. So I think as far as on-street parking for the residents of Belmont Street, there really wouldn't be any overlap with people coming through those times. So that's my piece on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Hi, my name is Abby Winkler. I live at 6A Belmont Street. I've lived there for about a year now, but last year I was dating Sean while he lived upstairs. And with the no parking on the streets, it made it very difficult for visiting overnight just because I knew parking there equaled a ticket and wasn't allowed to park at the parking lot across the street, which gave me very limited visiting time and parking availability. So I wanted to bring that up. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I'm Lauren Buchanan, and I'm the landlady, the owner here. We've had these buildings for a long time, and we do have some parking places for our tenants. And I know that if they have guests, that they don't have the parking places, but I know that the tenants are the ones that would have to be on the street, not the guests. And we have we just have limited spaces, and I've seen Otterson Street next door. They have parking spaces, two-way roads. This is a one-way street. It's wide enough for fire trucks to get by and parking, and yet we don't have it. Right around the corner on Elm Street, we also have that building across from the school. And I hear there's a problem with speeding traffic on that street, and I've been told that time and time again, it's been proven if there's some on-street parking, it does tend to slow down traffic, and that would really help in that area too. So we're hoping that we can get our tenants to have some overnight parking. Their guests can always park in their other spots that we do have in the area. But it would be really valuable for them to be able to pull on Belmont Street and maybe this 110 Elm area right at the corner to slow that traffic down, park there if they need to, and have parking on Belmont Street. That's what we're hoping for. And I just want the best for my tenants because we have some great tenants in this building usually. So I'm trying to help. That's it.
Wonderful. Thank you. So let me just speak briefly. And Director Cummings, if you'd like to add to the conversation, you're more than welcome to. We went through a process, how old is it now? 2013? All right, so it's 4 years old. And we began this process of experimenting with overnight parking on certain streets downtown. And we did a trial study for a year. And at the end of that year, we decided, yes, we're going to continue with this program. So it started in 13, it continued in 14, 15, and so forth and so on. Many aldermen then became interested in introducing legislation that would say, okay, I want to add this street to it, to that overnight parking list of streets where we would allow it. And then 2 weeks later, we'd have another street come in. And then a month later, we'd have 2 more streets come in. So what we've done this term, this year, is we've said, okay, let's address the issues that we know of right now, and let's resolve those and get those taken care of. And then let's take a pause. And in fact, this evening, Director Cummings is coming before this committee to talk about what he would propose as that next step of streets that should be included. So I believe you're going to have a priority list that says we should do these first, we should, and as soon as we get these done, this is the next set of streets that should be considered, and so forth and so on. So instead of taking this ad hoc approach to having aldermen introduce which streets should be included, we've gone holistically and we've asked our Director of Economic Development to provide us with what that list should be. I believe what he heard this evening was that Belmont and Elm should be an area that we should absolutely look at. And I'm hoping that we might be surprised this evening and maybe that area might be on the list. I don't know if it is or not. And if it's not, then this is something that he's going to take away, and it's going to become that next action item for him to look into and really understand what the impact is in that area. And I know that in most instances, I'm not certain if it's all, but in most instances, we don't have anything south of Kinsley Street. We don't have any parking areas that are south of Kinsley. There might be one street. But we can take a look at it. And if that's an area that we need to consider, then the action becomes Director Cummings' action. Please come forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, for the record, Tim Cummings, Director of Economic Development for the city. As you just articulated, that is, we're currently going through the vetting process. I just wanted to affirm what you just said and make sure it's clear that what we are here tonight to discuss is what I would refer to as the Franklin Street neighborhood. That was essentially the first area that we are looking at next in the queue, and I would be looking to come back before you in October to actually discuss the tree streets in depth. And so Belmont Street and others would be discussed at that time. I can tell you and give not just the audience and this subcommittee here the reassurance that we've already started vetting the tree streets, and we started looking at it. You'll hear in more detail in a few minutes when we give our presentation that effort and some of what we've heard back from the various departments. So I can't give you any conclusive recommendations tonight on the tree streets, unlike what I can for the Franklin Street area, but I will confirm and commit to you that in October, I'll be prepared to do so.
Thank you, Director Cummings. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, you are more than welcome to stay and listen to the discussion that we're about to have. It might be educational and help you understand how we're going to look at that section as Director Cummings takes it away as an action item. So you're more than welcome to stay and participate in the process. And thank you for coming tonight. At this point, we will move on to the discussion section of the meeting, and we will talk about overnight parking. Would you like me at this point to bring up the map?
Please. And if I could call forward my colleagues here in City Hall.
Oh, most definitely. City Clerk Patricia Piazzu and Mr. Veo as well. Would you like Mr. Veo to join you?
Please.
All right, Mr. Veo.
Do they have the memo? I'll hand it out. You want to hand it them? Yeah, why don't you? So if I may, Mr. Chairman.
Please.
So, again, for the record, Tim Cummings, Director of Economic Development for the city. I'm here this evening to continue our conversation about the overnight parking program. What is being handed out now is a memo that will essentially outline in writing what I'm about to address to you verbally this evening. And I wanted to keep my comments brief, but essentially relative to the process that we've gone through thus far. As you know, we started this pilot overnight parking program in 2013. The city set out some criteria which needed to be met for a street to qualify. We executed on that pilot program. It's been relatively successful. We are now at a point where we're evaluating the program to see if we can address not just the inclusion of streets to participate in the program, but also the neighborhoods. So before you, you have a map that is outlining the differing areas that we've studied. It's essentially, for lack of a better way of looking at it, is it's broken down into 3 neighborhoods, though. I will call the first blue area 1A and 1B, 1A being the Franklin Street area and 1B being the Crown Hill area. I'm sorry, the French Hill area. And then you have on the left-hand side or on the west side of Main Street, what we refer to as the Tree Streets area, and then on the right-hand side or the east side of Main Street, what we refer to as the Crown Hill area. And so we started doing an analysis of the area that's highlighted internally here within the city to look at streets that we could include in the overnight parking program. I can tell you that we have vetted it internally with our technical staff and then various departments, and we've gotten some very good positive feedback. As recently as even yesterday, we sat down with DPW. The DPW expressed some concerns that I will caution that we need to vet out very carefully. So my comments tonight are recommendations that we continue moving forward with the understanding that we are going to be continuing our conversations with DPW to ensure that we are not impeding solid waste and snow removal here in the city. And those are two primary concerns that came from the DPW when we sat down with them yesterday. And so with that being said, and just a way of organizing ourselves, we needed to really just take a very incremental approach to this. So we focused very specifically on the Franklin Street area. Prior comments from this group and others was this was a good area to look at. And so for not just the committee here and the viewing audience at home, to remind you, the highlighted section is the section we studied. The bluish or purple highlighted roads are where you currently have overnight parking. And then we are started doing a preliminary review and analysis of the roads that are in pink, knowing that they met the 2013 standards. So with that being said, we had a very specific conversation of this neighborhood, and the administration wants to continue the conversation, and James Vea went out this afternoon to actually measure the roads. And we want to have this group entertain the idea of adding on-street parking, and Mr. Vea, correct me if I get any of this wrong, on Franklin Street from front to 44 Franklin, essentially the width of 34 Franklin Street, on the Franklin Street side parking spaces, because that can be accommodated specifically. And this is all outlined in your memo in more detail. So again, Franklin Street on the south side between Front Street and Locust Street, you can accommodate essentially 15 parking spaces.
Between
Front Street, which would be the other end. So, yep, right there.
Front Street is here.
So from Front Street all the way down to right around right there. Yep,
There's
right there.
Locust.
There's Locust. So essentially, that area right there can accommodate more on-street parking, approximately 15 spaces. So to be clear, there are other areas on the street that qualify, particularly closer to Main Street. However, taking in concerns addressed by the neighborhood, we wanted to address those concerns, so we pulled that back. And then we had some public safety concerns relative to the corner of Charles and Franklin, so we had to pull that back a little bit. So essentially, what we're left with is basically dumbbelled by Front and Locust, and giving us additional streets. Additional parking spaces on that street. And did I miss anything?
Just as a, if I may,
Mr. Vale?
just as a note, the street width between Front and Locust is 30 feet, and then when you get west of Locust, the street narrows down to 26 feet. And so, according to the parameters set forth in the 2013 pilot program, as well as the requirements of the fire department, the 26 feet is not wide enough.
Those were the public safety concerns I was specifically outlining.
Alderman Dell.
You had said that the purple streets already have overnight parking?
It's hard to see in this map, but the blue shadow or the transparent blue line that overlaps the purple is where it exists. And the purple stuff is the stuff we basically said we should review all this.
So I'm just
So
curious.
Fletcher, is this an example of where it already exists?
Correct.
And then on Franklin Street, where it doesn't have that shadow, it's just the line, it doesn't exist there, but you're proposing it to be on this street.
Well, we originally proposed it preliminarily, and now as we've done our evaluation, we're essentially going to shrink it to between Front
Just
and
in front of
Locust.
34 Franklin.
Correct.
What legislation is allowing that overnight parking in those existing streets?
The original.
Piecemeal.
Yeah.
Yeah, people came forward and
Mr. Veo?
Just one other note with the map, the highlighted orb you have there over what looks like an icon of sheets of paper. There is a whole pull-down list there where you can turn, the next one over. There's a whole list of things you can turn on and off. So if you wanted to shut off the proposed roads for consideration, there's a little check mark next to roads considered for overnight, and then you would just see the existing system. This is just to help clarify as you guys use the map.
And Mr. Chairman, if I may, I mean, my understanding is through piecemeal legislation along the way, some streets have been added and some participation has been added.
City Clerk Pietzu, do you have Fletcher and Green on your list of streets that currently exist in the overnight parking program?
That is correct. On Fletcher Street, they can park on the north side, and on Green Street, they can park on the west side.
Thank you. So, Mr. Veo, just a quick question. As I go back into this legend and as I click on this roads considered for overnight parking, Fletcher and Green are going to be highlighted again with a secondary color. Is there a reason for that?
Yes, the way the map was generated was using GIS data. And so basically what we did is we took all streets that are bounded or touched by a given neighborhood, and we asked GIS to put those out if they met the width parameters. And so
Okay.
we have two constraints.
So the roads considered for overnight parking are only determined by width, and Fletcher and Green qualify for that, even though they already exist within our ordinances to be streets that allow this to be done. Okay, so it's repetitive in a sense, but it verifies that they should be on there because of the width of the street, and we've already considered them, and they are already part of our ordinances. Fine, okay. Mr. Veo?
I would just add one note of complexity to that situation is when GIS puts out a width for the road, puts out one width. So some roads vary in width along their length. Franklin Street's a perfect example. The map told us that Franklin Street was 27 feet wide. Went out and field verified it, found out that this portion between front locus is actually 30 feet wide, sufficient to hold on-street parking. So beforehand was not wide enough. Going out and field verifying confirmed that it was in fact wide enough.
So just a process question, were you able to override the system then and say that it met the width requirement? Is that how it is included on this?
I would say there's about 5 to 10 streets in the whole system, which we've gone and put back in. And a couple that we took out. Locke Street and French Hill was one which the fire department had significant concern about. Even though it met the width concerns, it was considered too high a risk road to have police and fire vehicle.
So, and then what we're seeing on this particular road is only in front of 34 Franklin Street, is it wide enough? But we've got the entire road highlighted. We can't shut that off to say anything east of Front Street should not be considered for overnight parking. Anything west of.
This map was really meant as a first pass analysis to be handed off to DPW for a deeper street by street analysis, as they did in the 2013 pilot. In the 2013 pilot, they went so far as to create a complete drawing index, which outlined each individual space on a street because they were looking at hydrants, they were looking at corners and driveways.
Good.
It's a very good document, and we would look basically to replicate this for the rest of the analysis.
Okay. Any additional questions on what we've heard so far? All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So just continuing on ever so quickly, again, Charles Street, parking on the east side between Fairmont and Auburn Street. It's approximate length of 250, and we can accommodate approximately 8 parking spaces. And then thirdly, on Auburn Street, parking on the south side of the street, the entire length of the street of 1,000 in length, accommodating approximately 36 spaces. Those roads at this point rose up to the level where the administration felt comfortable continuing the conversation and the dialogue within this neighborhood. So we're going to be scheduled to meet with DPW again, I believe, the week of October 11th, or in that time frame, where we would be looking to discuss in further detail these streets to promulgate the type of document that Mr. Veo just referenced. So to note and to be clear, we essentially are not going to move forward with, I believe it's Thayer Court.
That's correct.
So Thayer Court, which is currently highlighted on the screen, that will go away, and that would not be included any longer. And so I just want to make sure folks are aware of that from a process standpoint. Essentially, in this area, this is where we would be looking to cover.
So I've got two questions, if you'd allow me. One is, why would Thayer Court be removed from the list? What's the rationale? And then two is, does this neighborhood want the overnight parking? So have we gone out to this neighborhood and say, hey, we're considering dropping in, you said 15.8 and some amount on Auburn Court. Does the neighborhood want it?
So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, to answer your question, Mr. Veo can speak in more detail about some of the grassroots canvassing, if you will, to understand the
That'd be
neighborhood.
great. I'd love to hear that.
But then in addition to that, I just want to speak directly to Thayer Court, which is feedback from DPW was concerned specifically relative to snow removal and turning around and access, that they felt that wouldn't be a good place for overnight parking to be accommodated.
There is parking on Thayer Court right now, is that correct? I thought the businesses allowed parking adjacent to their buildings.
I think that's correct, yeah, but overnight parking is
Okay.
not allowed at this time.
All right. Mr. Vale, could you help me understand the need that's been expressed by the community in this particular area? Some of the grassroots that Director Cummings was speaking of?
Absolutely. I would note that a lot of the information I'm getting right now is informal, as in I'm not documenting any of this in a formalized way, taking records of it. But what I am lucky enough is to share an office with parking manager Jill Stansfield, who probably gets somewhere between 25 and 30% of the calls for interest in on-street overnight parking. I assume the clerk's office probably gets the remainder of those calls. From what I'm hearing and things that get bounced my way, there is interest from people on Vernon Street. There seems to be some complaints flowing into the parking manager's office regarding people parking on street there. There's complaints flowing in about lack of parking on Auburn Street and interest in parking on Auburn Street. A matter of fact, a woman by the name of Alexa Bishop, who works at the Center for Women in Enterprise, was going to come in tonight. She had a schedule conflict, but she wanted to speak to the fact that she lives on Auburn Street, walks to work downtown, and is looking for a place to park her second car. And so we do get a lot of incidental calls. I do field the calls, intermittently where I can and where I can take stock of what the interest is. But really, what we had set out in the last meeting, I believe, is that once we'd come to a conclusion about moving forward with a larger subset of streets, that we would go out and conduct a public input session for that given area. Considering the strategy of just coming in with 3 streets tonight, I guess we could do it, but I think there's a lot of interest there already. We could formalize that if that's a desire, but I could speak to the fact that there is interest here.
Alderman Dowd?
Yeah, when you were looking at this, did you consider the remote possibility that we're gonna tie Franklin Street into the Broad Street Parkway and the potential for making Franklin Street one way?
Director comment?
Um,
I didn't realize we were gonna make Franklin Street one-way, so,
No, that's just,
Potential.
it's been talked about, but
when was it talked about? Because it would have been talked about in this committee, correct?
I think it was in the, when we were talking about all the one-way streets, as a potential.
I do know in the previous, Mr. Chairman, if I may, I do know
Please.
in the previous administration, the Director of Economic Development did take an effort into looking at one-way streets, so maybe at that time. But I have not ever heard, nor am I aware of any efforts for Franklin Street to be one-way. So to answer the Alderman's question very specifically, no, that was not taking into consideration. I do understand that there is the ambition at some point to connect Franklin Street or some area on that side of the river to the Broad Street Parkway. I don't believe this project would have any impact on that at this time. And so we can continue to move forward without impeding that from occurring. You make a good point, and I will keep that in the back of our mind as we move forward.
Thank you. One caution that I have, and it was with regard to how Mr. Veo described not capturing the data. I hope somebody's capturing the data, and I hope it's either the city clerk or it's a parking enforcement, is it Stansfield?
Operations, yep.
It needs to be captured somewhere. We can't just go into this blindly and say, oh, we think it is because we've heard people say something, and that's not enough for us to make a decision. So any opportunity we have to capture and record and have interest expressed, and I mean, for these, for Franklin, for Charles, and for Auburn, and I don't know if you needed to include, is it Donovan Court? Oh, Beacon Court.
It's already.
Oh, is Beacon's already in there?
Beacon's
Oh,
already in.
that's right, that's what that shows. I mean, I would at that point send out a communication, a notice that it fits within so many feet from those roads or that area. I would send, similar to what we do upstairs with zoning and planning, and send out a postcard, say, we'd love to have your input, meet us at, on this day and time. Director Cummings.
So that is our intention and plan. We needed to have a more concrete list. And so this is evolving. I mean, and so we're getting to that point for this particular neighborhood where we can actually have that exercise. I know it's something that Alderman Lopez has been very strongly advocating for, and I've committed to doing that. But I'll point out one area that we haven't discussed yet, which it is not, as of today, the administration's recommendation, but something that I think we will be potentially evolving towards is Fairmont Street. And I suspect that this list of 3 may grow by 1 or 2 more. And once we get to that point, so we are not misrepresenting to the neighborhood what is being seriously entertained, that's when I would have that specific conversation so we know whether we're acting in a good direction.
Thank you. And you're just speaking of this portion of Fairmont that's highlighted?
Correct.
Between Amherst and the intersection of Fairmont and Charles?
Correct,
All
yeah.
right. City Clerk Piazza, did you have a comment that you wanted to
So
make?
anyone that is calling into our office, we are tracking. So I can say that as of just even September 5th, we did have a request from Thayer Court, and then on the 6th from Auburn Street. We've only had 1 request from each, but we do it just like the individuals here from Belmont Street. We do track it if they are calling our office. So I'm not sure if it's being tracked up there, but they
Is
want
it
to
being
send.
tracked up there?
They want to flip a email down to us, be happy to add it onto our list and everything.
Okay.
I have a question.
Let them, Mr. Vale?
Just in brief, when Jill Stansfield, parking manager, gets a call in that refrain, she does send them down to be added to the list. You know, I don't get directly involved with that. I just get the incidental of sharing an office with her, so.
Mr. Comment.
Thank you.
Director Cummings.
However, this is actually a good segue to actually another point that I'm going to bring up in a few moments, which is looking at creating an efficiency by trying to consolidate all the permitting and all the licensing of parking in one centralized location. So it would almost be like one-stop shopping for our customers here in this city. I've had a conversation with our clerk. There seems to be an interest on her end and an interest on my office's end to possibly merge the two into economic development and parking operations. And so I would be looking to continue that conversation so we can have an efficiency, so there isn't data that gets missed between the two. So I would be looking to make that more formal recommendation to this committee to be part of the legislation. And while I'm at it, I'll also note that it was discussed that we should bring up the overnight parking permit fee from $10 to $50 a year. So with that being said, I do just want to make sure I'm clear on the other two streets, because I don't think we've spent a lot of time on that. That's Charles Street with 8 additional spaces and Auburn Street with an addition of 36 spaces. I just wanted that for the record.
So it's 36, 8, and 15 for a total of,
59?
59?
thank you. All right,
59.
Alderman Dowd and then Lopez.
When you're looking at these streets, like Fairmont as an example, the individual houses that have driveways and garages shouldn't be looking for overnight parking. If there are tenant, buildings there, that's a different story. If there's not enough off-street parking, I don't think we ought to be approving overnight parking on streets where there's enough off-street parking.
Director Cummings.
Thank you. So, and you raise a good point, Alderman Dowd, and we will act at the pleasure of this body. I will note, though, that part of what this exercise is a good, healthy planning exercise, and we need to accommodate for what the zoning calls for. And so I can just tell you that I'm thinking about not just today, but I'm thinking about Nashua 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now, and everything that's outlined above has an opportunity to be multifamily in some iteration, and I would suggest that the quality of tenant the city deserves to have, you should be able to accommodate their parking.
Alderman Lopez.
I'd just like to comment that if there's a call-in list, then we should be sure to include all the people who showed up tonight interested in on-street parking, or otherwise we could just encourage them to do a petition. And then it's a similar strategy for the Fairmont Street. I think it's important to get the neighborhood's input. To Alderman Dowd's point, many neighbors might have off-street parking. On the other hand, many neighbors have multi-unit buildings, and they may want the parking. So some parts of the street might want parking, whereas the other parts don't. And that's an important part of this process. And that was why I've been such a strong advocate for the Economic Development Office, making sure that they have a mechanism for collecting public input, because we can go out street by street and canvass at a grassroots level, but the data doesn't always get collected accurately, and it's not a holistic thing. We were looking at the Franklin Street area when we last met 2 months ago, I think it was, to discuss this. But in the meantime, nobody's been paying attention to the Elm Street area, where they have every single night, every single day, trying to find parking. So I think it would be a good idea to take, even if this is just a prototype or a general idea, a proposal, if you will, of what the parking plan would be, put it up somewhere so that people can see what we're thinking about before we start developing really specific ideas without getting any community input. This doesn't have to be a final edition. I know that the Riverfront plan wasn't a final edition by any sense of the word, but even just having a way for people to send an email or make a comment with regards to their street and be aware of what's being asked, I think it's going to save us a lot of trouble in the future, because people who want parking right now will understand if it's on the list, like the area with Elm Street that is being asked for is on the list, at least they would know that there's some value in waiting. And if it's not on the list, they know that they need to speak up. And if it's on the list and they don't want it, then at least they can start giving us a heads up right away that, wait, this isn't what we want, and this is why.
Thank you, Alderman Lopez. Alderman Shoneman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question about Fairmont. If Fairmont, if it meets the width requirement, I don't understand why we're not considering it at this time. What's the reason for waiting on that?
We're working through that issue very specifically with DPW.
Okay.
It's a fair point that you're making, but we're not there yet.
Okay, thanks.
Alderman Dowd.
I've always supported the original legislation that Alderman Sherman brought in about downtown parking, because people live down there, shouldn't have to have concerns about where they're gonna leave their car. As we expand this, the reason I asked the question about the single-family homes on Fairmont is, as we expand this, when we allow overnight parking, particularly in the winter, and the cars are there all night, they plow the streets, people leave, and now you're like Boston, the plows have to come back whenever the cars are gone. I'm just concerned that we talked to BPW about the added workload of having to go back to the streets 2 or 3 times to get them cleared. So, again, if there are multifamily homes and there's not enough parking off-site, I fully agree, we should do what we can to allow people to park. But years ago, they did away with overnight parking across the city, especially in the more rural areas, because the police had an issue with it, BPW had an issue with it. So I think what we're doing is admirable, because people downtown do have a right to make sure their car is safe. But again, if we're going to expand this, we have to be concerned about the added workload to city departments.
Director Cummings.
And I just want to reiterate Alderman Dowd's point. I concur. We are being very sensitive to that. That's part of the reason why this process is taking a little bit longer than what I originally hoped or anticipated. But we want to address all of our internal departments' concerns and make sure we are developing a comprehensive and a good approach that meets everyone's needs, and it's a balancing act. We are trying to balance everyone's concerns, the neighbors, our internal departments, our businesses, and try to move this forward.
Just going, one additional
Go
thing.
ahead, Alderman
Just
Dowd.
going back to Thayer Court for a minute. I've been on that street many times. I have no idea why. But it is a dead-end street, basically.
Correct.
And there is, as I remember it, there is some off-street parking.
Private.
I don't know how many tenants there are, whether there's an issue. But I do know that if a plow goes down there, they have a heck of a time turning around.
That's my
And if there were additional cars blocking their way, they may not be able to turn around. So I can see where they may have a concern to that particular street.
So you've mentioned, of the departments that you've mentioned working with, I know that Public Works, Fire.
Mhm.
Is police part of the conversation?
Absolutely.
Is parking enforcement part of the conversation?
Absolutely.
Those are 2 separate entities, is that correct?
Correct.
All right. Anybody else? Any other?
Well, yep, actually, Mr. Chairman, this is a little bit off topic right now than this specific neighborhood, but continuing this more comprehensive approach, we've started doing some analysis in the tree streets, and with that being said, Mr. Veo has had lengthy conversations with the school administration.
Okay.
In fact, we have a communication that came into us late yesterday afternoon that we want to make sure is before you and on the record, so I'm going to ask Mr. Veo to hand that to you. And the school administration outlines their strong concerns relative to Elm Street. And so we're going to, we can get that out to everyone here. But again, the primary issue that they're outlining is Elm Street. And maybe if you want to bring it up on the map so we can outline it in a little bit more detail, essentially where the school is, their very specific concerns is the Elm Street parking. They being the school administration and do not want overnight parking on Elm Street because of fear that the spaces would not be available in a timely manner for the school staff when they need to come into the building. So we need to look at that, and we need to really address that and make sure we're taking into the school's needs as we move this neighborhood forward.
Thank you. Alderman Lopez and then Dowd.
Well, I just wanted to comment, actually, when we first went down to neighborhoods, I want to express appreciation for Mr. Veo going down with us to speak to the neighbors specifically. And because he was on the spot, he was able to look at the likely traffic and planning issues that were going to come about. So I think his response to the school's concerns and the plan that looks like it's lined out here is good. And I think the Economic Development Office will greatly benefit this planning by listening to all of the people in the community, not just the residents, but major players like the school, which is going to bring people in and out, but also trying to figure out a way to balance those needs against the needs of the people who live there. So I think this is going to go a long way towards resolving tension where residents feel like they don't get parking, but the school's running their neighborhood. But on the other side, the school could get exasperated very quickly if teachers can't figure out where they're parking. To that end, that kind of flexibility of what's going on the street and in that neighborhood, particularly, and I don't want to redirect us all the way back to Fairmont Street, but just as an example, if there isn't as dense a population of need there, you may be able to come up with a compromise between what DPW needs for snow removal and parking on one side of the street only instead of putting the stalls on both sides or integrating that into the plan. So with that in mind, I think that having this discussion in this committee and having this plan be communicated to the public is very important because there's a lot of people who have different says and different opinions. And it's important for us to demonstrate how complicated this issue is so that people know what economic development has been working on all this time, so that people who are only looking at, why can't I get a place for my tenant? I'm trying to rent this out. Doesn't the city want my business? They're looking at that part of it, but a greater awareness of the complexity, I think, would assure a lot of people that work is being done, and we're just trying to make sure we get it right.
Thank you, Alderman Lopez. Alderman Dowd?
Yeah, having been involved with the school department for a number of years, there's never been enough parking for staff around the Elm Street school. And they have tried over the years to figure out how to get more parking and have added a few spaces here and there. They are looking at some potential changes to Elm Street School that may or may not go through, but some of that includes additional parking. If they were able to get additional staff parking, it might open up the possibility for this overnight parking. But in the short term, I agree with them. I don't think this is viable.
All right.
Can I just speak to that real quickly?
Certainly, Alderman Lopez.
So if I understand this right, and I guess Director Cummings can correct me if I'm not, because the school was concerned about that, there isn't on-street parking in the Elm Street parking spaces for overnight. They would be putting it on Belmont Street, which nobody can park on anyway right now, overnight. So am I wrong in understanding that this isn't going to hurt the teachers in any way? It's only going to be parking for the residents on that street where they can't park right now?
I'll let Mr. Veo. So if I may, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Veo went out yesterday and met with the school administration and had a lengthy conversation with the school. So I defer to him on the specifics of this.
Mr. Vale?
The school does not use Belmont Street. They don't see a conflict. Matter of fact, in the letter which I've provided to you, they suggest that the overnight be shifted towards Belmont Street. I think Belmont Street is long enough that it could create a decent amount of capacity for the constituents that are here today. And so it may significantly, maybe not 100%, but significantly alleviate parking issues over there. It will be important over time to note that on a street-by-street basis, the constituents that are here today, some live at an address that is Elm Street, and some live on an address that's Belmont Street. When we manage the overnight program in a way where you can only get a permit if you live on a specific street, it creates a very challenging situation for allowing people within a whole given neighborhood to get a permit and walk a block. And I think over time, my recommendation would be that we transition to a neighborhood-based approach for permitting while having signage for specific streets. And That's all.
Director Cummings.
So, to go back to Alderman Lopez's very specific point, Elm Street right now would not be contemplated as outlined in the map, nor would Lake or West Otterson. But in conversations with the school administration, I think they would be open to having something for overnight parking along at least Lake Street, I think. No, is that inaccurate?
Yeah, I
Oh,
mean, they
and then-
claim capacity.
Is it West Otterman?
West Otterson,
West
Elm,
Otterson.
and Lake are necessities for them.
Okay. Okay. So maybe we can't do something along those side streets there. I was hoping that maybe we could pick up some along the side streets, but part of the concern is from the school administration's point of view is technically the cars would need to be gone at a certain hour and then the school personnel need to come in. So that overlap is just a little too tight. And if someone doesn't move their car, they have 48 hours. And so those type of conflicts are what they're trying to avoid. We are very cognizant of that. I think we might be able to address some of those concerns and relieve some of those anxieties over time, but that's going to be a longer conversation.
Alderman Lopez.
I just want to say, I think you can, and I think that's already been started here. So what I was trying to point out is we don't have to pit the needs of one group of community people against another. There are solutions, and you are finding them. So, I mean, the issue with Belmont isn't perfect. I mean, they might have to walk around the corner, but as James Veo pointed out, having a regional approach to parking is probably something we'd be looking at anyway, because it makes sense once you have more of the on-street parking. You don't want people from 4 blocks away taking up the space because of whatever circumstances going on over there. So I think I just want to articulate that this process is working, in my opinion, and there are solutions being found because they're looking at the specific neighborhoods and they're getting feedback from the people in the neighborhoods, like the school and like the residents.
So if I may, Mr. Chairman, just to conclude, we've outlined some recommendations to this body this evening. Right now, what I would suggest we do is, if there's no disagreement with some of the recommendations that we made, I would like to basically memorialize these recommendations, put it as part of an overall master list, come back to you in a couple weeks with further discussion and review of the tree streets, and then continue on and so forth with the other neighborhoods as discussed.
So let's just talk about the things that you want to memorialize. I'm assuming they're Franklin Street, Charles, and Auburn Street.
Correct.
I know that you mentioned briefly about the idea of increasing the parking, overnight parking sticker from 10 to 50.
Correct.
I'm assuming that's going to be brought through with legislation.
All of this.
And so would all of that happen at the same time? You foresee that?
Mr. Chairman, if I could, ideally, I would be looking to do this all in one piece of legislation.
Okay.
I defer to you, and I mean, in terms of how you wanted to handle it, but just to keep it simple, I would like to try to have it go through in one piece of legislation. And also, there's another point in this memo which I don't think I went into great detail on, which is the idea of creating essentially a separate fund, a trust fund, if you will, for management of this overnight parking program. That is essential, I think, to make sure that we are able to appropriately handle the needs of this overnight parking program and accommodate it appropriately.
Where's your statement about the fund? Where is that identified in this two-page memo?
Yep, so on the second page, it's in the very last line of the last paragraph. It's the third line down. Additionally, it is recommended that the committee consider establishing a special revenue account as identified in the 2013 pilot program ordinance. Revenue, which we're estimating to be about 25,000, would be used to pay for the administration, maintenance, and upkeep of the overnight parking program. So that's, again, we didn't go into great detail on that tonight, but I don't want to ignore that recommendation. I think that's something that we should consider. You know, part and parcel of this is, if you haven't noticed, I'm trying through the Office of Economic Development to create a more streamlined, efficient, and parking operations for the city. A separate piece of legislation, which is before this body, is moving enforcement from police to operations to create those synergies that right now, in my opinion, are not being met, and we'll be able to more effectively manage and give a better service to the city. So this overnight parking program is just yet another example of this overall arching effort that you know, I think will be good for the city.
Great. Alderman Dow, did you have a question or comment?
Well, I was just going to make a suggestion that you might want to break it into two pieces of legislation. Reason being is, if you're going to go from $10 to $50 and you want to establish a special revenue fund to collect this, I would hate to have that hang up the parking part of this, you know. Yes, it can be amended, but it just might be cleaner if you had two pieces of legislation.
Thank you, Alderman Dowd. Alderman Lopez?
I was just going to ask if the $50 increase was being driven by the estimated expense. And then additionally, I don't know if Director Cummings has this information, but I like the idea of having the parking enforcement being done by economic development instead of the police, because I think the police should be more focused on crime than I parked in the wrong place for too long. But I was also wondering if he's aware as to whether or not the parking enforcement is relative to the patrol zones, or if they have a different mechanism of doing that.
Director Cummings?
They have overnight, they have parking enforcement zones, but those aren't quote-unquote patrol zones.
They're not the same as the other ones.
No, not that I'm aware of, no.
I was just thinking that I know several zones intersect right in the area of Main Street and West Hollis. So I've heard not a small number of times that people get nailed for parking more often. And I was just thinking maybe it's because that neighborhood has 3 times as many police officers coming through.
I will look into that and check. If I may, Mr. Chairman, the one concern I will raise is I am trying to deliver a comprehensive product to the city, and if we do one without the other, I don't want to handicap my department. I want to make sure I'm clear on this point, that having that special revenue account set up to support this program is critical. And so if we were to move in this direction, I look at it in a more holistic approach. You can't have one without doing the other well. And so we can have more conversations about that as time goes on, but I do want to at least be on the record for that.
Thank you. Alderman Shoneman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I kind of like that idea. I think that there's advantage to splitting things up, making sure legislation gets passed through, but at the same time, it's all part of it. And at this stage, I don't see any objection to any individual piece that I've heard about. So I just might comment on that. Just one other question on the program, and that is, are we contemplating guest passes at all? And selling guest passes, is that ever part of it, or just curious? Temporary.
Not as of yesterday, but as of today.
Else we can sell, by the way.
Yeah.
I lived in a place where we had.
Somerville had that.
Somerville had
Yes,
that.
I know, I'm
We had
familiar.
permits and we had guest passes, and you could buy your permit, then you could also buy guest passes.
Yeah.
And for those who wanted them, they had them, and it's a few extra bucks, not as much as the full. It was more than a nickel. Yeah, it was maybe $5 or $10, but anyway.
Interesting concept.
Yeah, I mean, and The one thing I will commit to this body is I will come back with data to support the $50 figure. I feel very, very strongly that I need to show market justification for that ask. I will do that. I haven't done that yet, but my understanding is that that is a reasonable number to approximately project for right now.
All right. Alderman Lopez?
I just wanted to +1 the guest pass idea, because not only do we want guests in Nashua, but someone taking responsibility for them would be great. Like, we'd know whose guest they are, and that person would be able to tell them, like, hey, here's the pass so you can park or whatever, instead of, oops, sorry about that, you got a ticket, and then now we're stuck explaining to a completely different person what's going on.
Thank you, Alderman Lopez. Okay. Mr. Veo?
Ever on a sales pitch, I would just note that $50 a year works out to about a little less than 15 cents a day. It's a heck of a deal for parking.
So are you in favor of it, Mr. Veo, or are you opposed to it? Would you like to raise it more than $50?
I'm just speaking to the fact that as soon as this meeting's over, my boss is going to ask me to put together a market analysis.
Excellent point. Very
Less than a
astute.
nickel an hour.
Very astute of him.
All right. I think, I think as Alderman Schoenman pointed out, I think if you introduce them, and as Alderman Dowd suggested, if you introduce them as two independent pieces of legislation, I think we all understand that they're complementary of one another, and they need to both be passed. I think the market analysis is vital into providing supporting data for the increase in fees. And then the last piece that still is missing for me is not about the legislation, but I know that we've had City Clerk Pietsu sitting here for at least an hour and 15 minutes, and there's a missing piece on we still need to purchase tickets for the next calendar year. We need to know what the inventory is so that you'll have an appropriate quantity plus some percent above and beyond. Are we at that figure yet? I mean, because I know what you just told me was we're going to focus on Franklin Street or that Franklin Street area, and you'll come back in a couple of weeks to talk about the tree streets. So was DPW able to provide us with the number in the inventory, and do we have something to move forward with, or are we waiting a couple more weeks now? Director Cummings.
Thank you. So I had a specific conversation with our clerk yesterday. I don't want to hold her up, and I know that this is a sensitive issue. I thought we would be moving a lot faster than what we are. I can't commit that we're going to get this done for this year. I don't want to. Often what happens in government is as soon as you take time pressure off something, this will start to fall by the wayside. So
All right, I needed this yesterday.
so I don't want to necessarily say that we need to push this out for a year, but I think keep starting to entertain that is going to be important.
We've got to get a number to, we were talking about this in August, if not earlier than August.
June.
About getting a number.
June.
Right. And so at this point, it just does, if we want to do Franklin Street and we want to add 59, stalls to the inventory, great, we install 59 stalls to the inventory. We up your number that you already have by 59. And anything else that's on this that you're going to be presenting in the month of October, I think I don't know if we can support it any longer. This year. This calendar year. I mean, if we want to wait till next spring to, I don't know. You tell me if I'm wrong. We're going to have snow.
Right.
We're not going to be able to see the stalls. We've got to make sure that enforcement and all the departments are aware of what it is that the expectations are.
Mm-hmm.
We need to order next year's stickers, and I know that we've been putting those off. And I don't know how much longer you can put them off.
So on that note, I would need to know by December 1st, if we could have everything wrapped up by December 1st, this way we know how many places we're going to have for next year. I think that's the most important part. As far as this year, if we were to bring those streets in, currently we have 340 passes permits that have been issued. So I have technically 60 left within the 400. I still have blanks that I could use, so I could cover those 59 spots.
Are you
For
able
those
to,
streets in there.
are you able to extend and use those blanks in next year's
No.
inventory?
No, we're not, because of course their expiration date is
Okay.
of each year. But
All right.
these, if we were to bring in these 59 spots before the end of the year, we would do it as long as the ordinance was changed to go over the 400 amount that's
Okay.
allowed under law.
All right. Director Cummings?
So I guess I'm sitting here and I'm a little torn. I have to suggest that or recommend to this body that we look to do it for the following year. I don't think we're gonna get it done for this year. I mean, knowing what we had to go through to even have a conversation to get us to a point where I feel comfortable with Franklin Street, I don't know if we'll be able to get through the tree streets
So let me ask it
by
this way.
By December 1st.
Let me ask it this way. You've learned a process which you need to work through in order to do the Franklin Street area.
Mhm.
And you have to replicate that process for the tree streets now.
Correct.
Are you able to identify any efficiencies that it could be done quicker, better, faster? You know the people that you're working with now. Is there the potential to find efficiencies in the process to make it work quicker?
It will be very tight, but we might be able to do the tree streets.
Okay.
It will. I don't want to commit to that right now, but
Understood.
I understand the people behind us need this. I get it. It will be my highest priority. I've already said that to you this summer. I've come back in good faith, trying to advance this issue. I think we will get there, but it will be very tight for a December 1st timeline.
Okay. Alderman Dowd.
Yeah, if you are addressing this in phases, your plan might say that we will do phase 1 or phase 1 and 2 this year,
Mhm.
and we'll look at phase 2 or 3 next year.
Yeah.
You know, and make it sort of a living time frame that you can meet. The other thing is, I know I've been talking to BPW about painting lines. You got 2 constraints. One, weather,
Mm-hmm.
and because when it gets too cold, they can't paint them. And they start having other things to do.
And then when there's snow on the ground, you can't paint them.
Yeah, you
Right.
definitely can't do it when it starts snowing. But, and the other thing is time. It
And
takes time to do that, and they have to plan it into their schedule, so you might want to talk to them about how many spaces can you
Right.
paint between now and, say, the end of October.
Otherwise,
and signage.
we might need Mr. Veo to engage with the, I think you identified, Alderman Lopez, you identified yourself as a co-founder of Positive Street Art?
And if anyone ever let us. Oh, no. I don't think.
No, I
don't
think that
we're
would be,
literally allowed
I
to,
think
though.
that there would be a grievance filed at that point.
We've had conversations like that in the past. And I'm pretty sure I remember.
though, would be very artistic.
They would be.
I actually remember a story where an alderman tried to paint a crosswalk without permission and got arrested, so.
All right, a little lighthearted. Mr. Veo.
Points well taken.
Not one to go out of the way to diffuse a ticking clock, but I believe, and Tricia could probably correct me if I'm wrong, but I
Would that be
believe
City Clerk Piazza?
apologies. City Clerk Piazza can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the stickers for last year came in around $600, give or take.
It was low, a little over 500.
So that's for a number of 400 stickers, and so we could potentially just number stickers up to 600 or 800 and just assume that, you know, as this thing grows, we'll have capacity to meet that increased demand. That's not a significant increase. I mean, I think the space inventory for the full area, if it were fully implemented, would be around 1,400 spaces. So we're just talking about a small incremental increase for next year, anticipating that we're not going to have a flood of new demand.
What'd you do for your 18 budget?
500, I budgeted for 18 budget $550. We
Okay.
do order, for this program, we always order 100 extra with blanks on it due to the fact that people that are switching vehicles, you do not want to take up one of the permanent numbers for somebody that's switching out of vehicles because they traded it in.
Okay. Alderman Dowd.
Just out of curiosity, are you familiar with the way the landfill does their permits? They write your license plate number on it, and I don't think there's a serial number. There is a year, but I don't think there's a serial number. It's just your license plate number, and that's what allows you to.
Yeah, our stickers are non-transferable, that's why they have to bring it in if they get rid of the vehicle and everything like that, or if they trade vehicles or anything like that. Their license plate does go on the sticker,
Okay.
and they are numbered, and of course, the expiration date is on there.
Okay.
All right. So you need your information by December 1st.
Correct.
Director Cummings, you and Mr. Veo are coming in to our meeting in October with some additional information, memorializing Franklin Street and bringing something forward for tree streets. If we do that in October, we'll meet on the 11th and the 25th of October. We'll meet again on the 8th and maybe the 22nd of November, and then we start dealing with Thanksgiving. And then at that point, you've expired your time. We only have 3 meetings left as far as an infrastructure committee to listen to your input for us to be able to make decisions. Alderman Dowd.
Again, going back to the phasing of this, if the tree streets were too large to tackle in one, break it into 2 phases on tree streets. And I think you have an inclination which should be in which first phase.
Yep. Okay. I think I can move this forward. I understand what the timeline that needs
All
to
right,
be done.
very good.
Thank you.
Alderman Lopez.
I just wanted to, I appreciate all the effort that is being put into this, and I know that everybody who benefits from this directly is going to really appreciate it when they get it, and then probably forget their appreciation later. So I just want to express now, thank you for putting all the time, effort in, and trying to make sure that it happens in a timely manner too.
Thank you, Alderman Lopez. City Clerk Piazza, any additional needs that you have or any additional comments with regard to the overnight program?
No, we will wait for the decision to see what comes out of the committee. We'll continue to work with Economic Development Director and his staff and everything to make sure that we continue to track, and hopefully we can get this to fruition.
Wonderful. All right. Mobile pay app is the second part of this conversation. All right. What do we have?
So yes, Mr. Chairman, just a quick status update on the mobile pay app endeavor. And I will have Mr. Veo go into more detail, but as you may recall, we came before you in August and we introduced this concept. We are continuing to move forward with conversations internally here in the city. I know there were some specific questions raised relative to parking enforcement. Again, I will have Mr. Veo go into more detail, but I can communicate to you this evening for the record that we sat down with parking enforcement specifically, as well as anyone relative to parking operations, and had a very specific conversation on this mobile pay app program, including IT, to work through the very technical details to ensure that we were moving in a direction that was appropriate for everyone in this city. And so with that being said, I will defer to Mr. Veo to go into more detail. But essentially, the track that we're driving towards is we're looking to put out an RFP sometime, over the winter. It won't be just the Economic Development and Parking Operations Office administering the RFP. We'll put together a selection committee, so there'll be someone from IT, there'll be someone from parking enforcement, there'll be someone from community development, to have a holistic approach when we actually go through and selecting a vendor. but I'm getting a little ahead of myself in the steps. I just wanted to kind of quickly outline the process for you to ensure that you knew that we were taking a holistic approach. But I wanted to come back before you tonight and let you know that we have addressed the specific concerns that were brought up relative to parking enforcement back in August.
Thank you. Mr. Vale or Alderman
Good.
Dowd?
Good.
Who wants it? Mr. Vale, you taking it?
Please.
It's yours.
I don't have much more to color in than what the Economic Development Director Cummings has stated. We had a comprehensive interdepartment meeting with the express task of talking about this as well as the overnight parking. We covered both topics. Enforcement asked specifically about whether or not their existing handhelds and their future handhelds would be able to receive this data. We proceeded to explain to them how the pay-by-cell service and the way the RFP is written will require that all current and future devices integrate with the software in a manner that allows them to look it up in a series of ways. One is when they start to type in a ticket, it will notify them. The other is that they'll be able to look at a whole entire zone and see all the plates that have already paid, so they could just have it up that way and look through. Additionally, the police department had noted that they would like to retain the ability to look at this data as well in case they want to be able to write a ticket on the fly, which we're happy to accommodate and should be able to do. We will be able to do and write into the RFP. Aside from that, staff who attended the meeting, which were, basically.
So, pardon me, I'm sorry. Talk to me a little bit more about the police having access to the data, and do they currently have access to the data for the pay and display?
That's a good question. I don't know if they currently have access to the kiosk data. That's an unknown to me.
Okay, but they're interested in having access to anybody who pays by a mobile device
Yes.
for a stall.
And in the way the pay and display service providers do that is they offer a back-of-house login for any staff. And so any staff can log in, look at specific zones. And, as long as they have an internet connection, they'll be able to seek and access this information.
All right, thank you, go on. Sorry to interrupt.
Not at all.
I had a question too.
Alderman Lopez.
Does this mean that the police would be able, because this could be an amazing tool for them, if somebody that they were looking for purchased a parking ticket, they'd be able to figure out where they're parked?
Potentially.
Like a manhunt?
Well, yeah, basically, if somebody wanted it and the person registered for a parking space, would they be able to figure that out?
They'd be very quickly be able to cross-check that license plate against the history of parking habits of that individual. So they would be able to see how often somebody parks in a given zone or in Nashua over the last 6, 12, however many months they've been parking there. And then they could basically maybe catch that person.
Yeah.
They could also see the current park, if they're currently parked, that'll enumerate in the database.
So they're going to start using the pay and display service instead of the mobile phone app. Okay.
Well, instead of parking at Shaw's and waiting for someone to walk by them, I mean.
We could
All right.
talk. Sounds like great marketing for the pay and display services.
It would save staff time, I think.
Alderman Dowd.
Not done yet. Good.
In summary, there were no hard objections from any of the departments relative to the implementation of this RFP.
Great. The second paragraph under follow-up with parking enforcement relative to pay-by-cell services, this section in the middle, second paragraph, third line from the bottom. Enforcement has, do you see that? I'm just trying to read the sentence. It
Has
has
not.
no concerns?
Has no
Correct.
No concern, okay.
Enforcement has no concerns about the procedural impact.
Thank you.
Yep.
All right. I didn't know if there was a word missing or,
It's,
okay.
it's a bad habit of mine. I rely on Tim for my grammar checks. So.
Director Cummings?
I missed that one, I apologize.
That was Director Cummings,
Director
correct?
Cummings.
Thank you. Alderman Dowd.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say that recently I was in 4 European countries and they use this extensively. And I did ask one police officer about it because the meters and stuff they use, of course, was in another language. And they said, well, they've been using it for a long time and it worked great. And I have to say, they're more sticklers about parking than we are.
Wonderful. All right, so you're releasing an RFP this winter?
Correct.
And then we'll expect to see something in the springtime?
Correct.
Excellent. Thank you for that update.
Thank you.
We were concerned last time about the impact on the parking enforcement officers with regard to how they would process license tags and typing it in. Now that they have the ability, or will have the ability to see those parked in a zone, then that will save time. The other thing that we learned is that it is illegal in the state of New Hampshire to take a photo of a license tag for something other than police purposes, and parking enforcement is not a police purpose. So we do not have the ability to scan in a license tag and check that against the database of tags that would potentially utilize this service. So thank you for finding the additional information that would support our decision-making process.
Certainly.
All right. Any additional discussion this evening, gentlemen? All right, wonderful. Communications, we've got a lot to
Yes, we do,
accept.
Mr. Chairman. We have several items, so I'd like to make a motion
Please do.
that the following items, that the rules be so far suspended to include the introduction of the following items because they were received after the agenda was prepared. And first of all, we have a petition relative to ordinance 017-042. There was a communication from a Mr. James Cutter to you, Mr. Chairman. He spoke tonight. There is a communication from Mr. James Veo to you, Mr. Chairman, regarding continuation of the overnight parking. It's a memo together with a satellite map. And finally, there is a communication from Elm Street Middle School to James Veo, which he shared with us tonight. And lastly, another memo from to the chairman from Tim Cummings, Director of Economic Development. Those items are, I'm requesting that they be included.
Very good. The only item that the members of the committee don't have is the communication from the Elm Street Middle School principal. We have a single copy. It'll be included in the minutes. I'm happy to read that to you now if you'd like to make it part of the record.
I actually saw an email.
All right, very good. So, we will, so the motion is to suspend the rules to allow for the multitude of communications that Alderman McGinnis just went through. Any discussion? All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. And we have suspended the rules to allow for the introduction of those communications.
Very good.
All right. Petition in support of ordinance 17042. So ordinance 1742 is authorizing the stop signs on North 7th Street at its intersection with Grand Avenue.
Okay.
We have a petition, which you should have on your desks, which we need to accept and place on file.
I'd like to make a motion, Mr. Chairman.
Please.
I'd like to make a motion to accept and place on file the petition that you just spoke about.
So Alderman McGinnis's motion is to accept and place on file the petition that's in support of ordinance 1742. Discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. All right, and that has been accepted and placed on file. And I'm wondering, I believe that we should probably make those same motions. We only suspended the rules to accept those, to allow for the introduction of them after the agenda was prepared. So I believe we should probably make the motion to accept and place on file the three communications, the one from the principal of Elm Street Middle School, the one from Mr. Veo regarding the update to review pay-by-cell services for metered parking in downtown Nashua. The communication from Mr. Cutter to Mark Cookson, Chair Infrastructure Committee, Jim Donchis, Mayor, and Steve Bolton, Corporation Counsel, regarding we want our present 7.5-foot wide driveway restored to its 10 feet 3-inch width. And there was one additional communication, which was to me, Alderman Cookson, Chair of Infrastructure Committee, from James Veo, Town Specialist, regarding the continuation of overnight parking program discussion. So those are the four communications that we need to accept and place on file. Discussion, Alderman Dowd.
Make a motion to accept and place on file.
The motion by Alderman Dowd is to accept and place on file the communications that were just stated. Any additional discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. Very good. Unfinished business,
There is none.
new business resolutions,
There are none.
new business ordinances.
Yes, we have an ordinance 017-042 authorizing stop signs on North 7th Street at its intersection with Grand Avenue.
Is there a motion? Alderman Lopez.
I'd like to recommend final passage and to speak on it.
The motion by Alderman Lopez is to recommend final passage. Alderman Lopez, the floor is yours.
So the intersection between North 2nd Street and Grand Avenue is very heavily trafficked. They're both by the people living on Grand Avenue, but also by the Boys and Girls Club, the parents picking up and dropping off in the Boys and Girls Club. There's athletic fields there. There's an access to Mine Falls. So as a result, there's a lot of traffic on there. The neighbors have expressed concerns over the past 2 years, really, that the speed is dangerous. Sooner or later, the kids of the neighborhood are likely to get hit. There's a lot of kids walking back and forth from the Boys and Girls Club as well. Nashua PD has studied the traffic several times and concurred that there's a lot of traffic, a lot more traffic than they would have expected on that road. We have most of Grand Avenue petitioning for us to do it, and a good sprinkling of North 2nd Street too.
Alderman Dowd.
Just a question, is that going to make this a four-way stop?
It
Yes.
will.
Having gone down that railroad track a few times, the BPW, they have criteria that they have to meet. I don't know what that is, but did this also go to BPW?
Yes.
Alderman Lopez.
Yes, I forwarded it to legal, and then they checked it with Board of Public, not BPW, but DPW.
Yes.
I think it was asking different, okay.
So,
Have we received a communication back from Public Works with regard to this intersection?
I don't know.
Alderman Dowd and then Shoneman.
yeah, I think that we probably should table this until we get that recommendation, because they usually call the shots on where you can have and can't have four-way stop signs.
So I've done a multitude of four-way stops. I think Alderman Shoneman has done some as well. Usually there's a warrant analysis that accompanies it. I'm not sure if the warrant analysis is required any longer. I don't know if Director Cummings has any knowledge of that. I won't pull you into the conversation then, as you shake your head vehemently no. But yes, why don't we take a look at it? Can we send a communication back to Public Works and ask them if a warrant analysis is still required at that intersection? And I'd love to have their input. I appreciate the petition, and I think it speaks overwhelmingly to the support. I've got, let's see, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
29.
12, 24, 29 individuals who are interested. I'm not sure how many households that is, but you've got 29 petitioners that are interested in a four-way stop at that location. Alderman Shoneman and then Dowd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with the conversation and the direction it's going. I appreciate people coming out and signing these petitions. I think it's very important, and we want to let everybody know that we take that very, very seriously. The analysis in the legislation does say, in its last sentence, the board, it doesn't say legal. It just says the board should consult with the city's traffic engineer to determine if this ordinance is in compliance. So I think we have to take that step. I do know there have been cases where traffic engineer may have said something and this board decided something different. That's perfectly fine. But there are certain parameters and rules. For instance, stop signs are not used as traffic calming. It has to be a reason that meets the requirement, and it sounds like this may very well, but I'm not a traffic engineer, so I would just want to say I concur.
Very good. Alderman Dowd.
I want to say I agree with the petitioners. I was there for a PAL event last month, and I agree that they probably would benefit from a four-way stop, but I'd like to see what they come back with on their analysis.
Thank you. Any additional discussion? Is there an amendment to the motion or another motion? Alderman Lopez?
I understand what the board is telling me. I just wanted to clarify that when I had requested this, it was copied to Steve Dukran, but I didn't hear back.
Okay. So let's just follow up with Engineer Dukran and whether he delegates that responsibility to somebody else. Let's just get an answer back from them with regard to the four-way stop. Alderman Dowd.
Motion to table to our next meeting until we get feedback from BPW.
All right, the motion by Alderman Dowd is to table. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Are those opposed? And we will table it until our next meeting. Ordinance 1743.
Yes, 017-043, rescinding the authorization for parking meters on the north side of East Pearl Street between Quincy Street and Home Street.
Is there a motion, Alderman Lopez?
I'd like to recommend final passage, and I'd like to speak to it.
Certainly, the motion by Alderman Lopez
Is to recommend final passage.
is to recommend final, thank you.
Yeah.
The motion by Alderman Lopez is to recommend final passage of ordinance 1743. Alderman Lopez, the floor is yours.
So there's only actually one parking meter on that stretch of street, and it's directly in front of Bridges Domestic Violence Shelter. So the thinking is that the last thing somebody needs when they're in distress and seeking help is to have to find a quarter. It's not really a significant amount of revenue or anything like that.
Any additional discussion? Alderman Schoeneman?
Thank you. Is there only one parking meter or is there only one parking space?
There's only one meter and space,
So there's no other space, it's just one space?
just one.
Okay, thanks.
It seems out of place. I think they just had an extra one and put it on because they were continuing down the road or something. I did find previous discussion of parking on Quincy Street, which is like parking meters on Quincy Street, but that one's all by itself.
Click the last box, it'll turn on the aerial photo, very last box in that layer list, and then you can see the street condition. There you go.
Thank you. So we're looking at the intersection of East Pearl and Quincy?
Yep.
Right here. Director Cummings.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for the record, Tim Cummings, Director of Economic Development, and I have parking operations under my purview. I just want to be on the record as opposing this piece of legislation. I understand its intent, and I'm very sympathetic to the cause. I will say, though, I am concerned about the precedent-setting nature of this type of issue, and we're somewhat going backwards in the philosophy relative to a parking meter program. I think we could potentially opening the door to other requests to come before you for other nonprofits who actually have to adhere to the same rules as everyone else in our paid for parking program. And so with those concerns in mind, and I understand this body needs to do what it needs to do, I just wanted to state that for the record.
Thank you, Director Cummings. Alderman Lopez.
I understand Director Cummings' point, and I do think as alderman, we're going to have to look at those situations if they did come up and judge them based on their merits. This one is just a very specific case where there's only one on the whole area, and it's directly in front of people who don't necessarily deserve to be paying for their parking.
Is this it right here? Is that the address or the location?
I can't see.
It's on East Pearl Street,
It's on
Mr.
East
Chairman.
Pearl?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, it's, yep,
Yep, that corner up on the top.
if you keep scrolling, yep, keep going, yep, it's right in that area,
This?
on the other side of the street. It's right along that area.
Yeah.
Yep,
Yep, where that car's parked.
and,
Alderman Dowd.
So, from what I see here, it's not the only parking space.
correct.
It's the one with the meter.
It's the only one with a meter?
Mm-hmm. From that point on for the rest of it.
No, but those,
Where the lawyers are, yeah.
These are metered.
That section of West Pearl onwards, or East Pearl onwards is that's the only meter on the rest of that street beyond the intersection of Quincy and East Pearl.
These are not metered, is what you're saying.
Yep.
Alderman Dowd.
Director Cummings, why is that one metered and the ones on the other side of the street aren't? How did we come with this arbitrary line drawn in the sand?
Mr. Chairman, if I may, that's a great question. I've asked that. The information I got is that there was a prior ordinance put into place that specified where the meters actually needed to be implemented, and it specifically says that meters need to be along that side of the street. It doesn't call for the other side of the street. My understanding is the other side of the street is regulated by 2-hour parking.
So this goes back to our downtown parking initiative, our 3 zones. That's where this is. And at that point in time, there were probably existing meters at the location. And then what we did was on Main Street, we put the parking stations. And we said, okay, we're going to reduce it to an hour and a half. And then, a block away on Spring Street, we're going to allow you to have 2-hour parking and for $1 and then, or whatever the price is. And then beyond that, we were going to have parking meters.
Correct.
And we're going to allow you to park there as for 8 hours for whatever the cost was per hour.
Mhm.
And that's why there were meters on this street. I know that there were meters on Quincy Street, but
They were removed.
we removed that. We removed Quincy Street from the area. So now there are no meters on Quincy Street. I think this one spot is just a geographic anomaly of where it sits on, what was it, East Hollis or East Pearl? Alderman Dowd.
My guess is if those 4 other spaces are metered in back of the one, that if we take the meter out of that space there, one of those people is gonna park there. And
Yeah,
you won't be able to get in there anyway.
So as I'm looking at this, and I don't know if you can see, I'm looking for shadows, and there appears to be a shadow here, which would, to me, mean that there's a parking meter there. And there's a shadow. Thought there was a shadow here
It
too.
looks like the same thing.
Yeah. So I think there are parking meters there in those 4 spots. Director Cummings.
I don't want to misrepresent anything, so I'm hesitant to say, definitively. I've been out to this site. I believe there are parking meters out there between Quincy and the end of East Pearl. I will go out and double check tomorrow and actually give you a communication, if you'd like, to actually specify what meters are out there and their usage. If I may, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to provide a little bit more context and color to this very specific issue, if I
Please,
may.
it's yours.
So I'm very well aware of this specific issue. My office has been trying to work with the nonprofit that requested this petition. We've made some suggestions and some recommendations to that organization. They have not wanted to pursue any of those recommendations. One of the recommendations we even were contemplating is trying to remove meters on another street that would be in close walking distance. Part of the concern is with East Main Street is it's a high volume road and parking should be managed more aggressively on a main throughway. And so you get the turnover necessary for other people in the area. And if you don't do that and you don't get that turnover, cars are going to tend to stay and become stagnant, similar to what's actually occurring right now on Quincy Street. It's part of the reason why it's not actually an option for that nonprofit to actually entertain. My fear is we'll be exacerbating the situation by doing this. Part of the revenue, we are not collecting a lot of revenue right now because a special accommodation was made for this nonprofit where, and my understanding is it never actually received any official approval by a body here in the city. They were allowed to put permits out on their dashboard, exempting them from the meters, and enforcement basically took that into consideration. And again, this has exacerbated the situation. So I can't tell you how much revenue is currently not being collected in that area because we don't have a good history. That's, again, another concern that I have relative to removing this meters in this area. I am very sympathetic to the nonprofit. We want to accommodate their concerns, and we would continue to want to work with them. I don't believe this is the right solution, though.
Alderman Lopez?
Are you certain you're referring to the nonprofit Bridges and not the soup kitchen, which parks in the public housing lot? Or staff does?
I want to be very clear. I'm speaking about Bridges.
Okay.
Alderman
I'm not
Sherman.
aware,
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Alderman Lopez.
I'm not aware of them having a parking pass. I am absolutely certain there aren't parking meters any further up there. I'm in that neighborhood a lot. I don't know whether there's a special arrangement or anything like that, but I know that they were very much in favor of removing the spot that was there. And I can understand why they wouldn't really want people who may be trying to discreetly enter and exit a place under traumatic circumstances to have to park in an adjacent street and walk over.
Alderman Shoneman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I'm sympathetic to the needs of these agencies too, but I think Director Cummings makes a very good point about this being kind of a thoroughfare type street. And the concern of the city, I think, ought to be that we manage these parking spaces. So to have the meter there, there's always going to be a car or the last stall. There's always going to be the last one before you transition to a section where there's no parking meters on that side. In fact, there's no parking at all, looks like, further east from this point on that side of the street. Nevertheless, since there has to be a last one, and this is right there, it would seem to me that ought to stay. I do like Director Cummings' suggestion about going out there and taking a complete inventory of, just make sure we know. I appreciate what Alderman Lopez has said about what he knows to be for parking meters, but might be good to have official record, what's out there, and then take a more complete look at it next
So
time.
Director Cummings, when you send downtown specialist Veo out there to look at the area, could you have him look at both the north and the south side of the street? And then between Quincy and Spring? But also, I'd be interested to know what these 4 or 5 spots, how they're positioned, if they're with meters or no meters.
Sure.
Okay?
And Mr. Chairman, if you bring it up another level, you'll see actually part of the problem in this area is, I'm sorry, no, back it up, zoom out a little bit.
Zooming out.
Zooming out, a little bit more. So part of the problem, if you see that big parking lot that is on Quincy Street, I believe, directly, yep, right there. So I believe, and that is full,
That's the courthouse.
and that's the courthouse. And what happens is then the courts have overflow parking onto Quincy Street, and it essentially goes from East Pearl all the way down to Quincy. And that area in particular is not well managed, so you're not getting the turnover necessary. So it actually becomes a detriment to all the residents, businesses, and otherwise in that neighborhood. So I'm suggesting this to you because I would ask that you consider Quincy Street as well, because I think that is something, if we were to tweak, we would be able to get better results for the entire neighborhood.
So you want meters and stalls on Quincy?
I won't go as far as to say meters installed, though I like that idea. But right now, I want to say there is no turnover requirement, and even getting to a 2-hour turnover regulation would help, I think, in particular, bridges.
So why don't you, while you're looking at this, just let us know. I mean, I wasn't in favor of having parking meters on Quincy Street. And when they had them there, and that's why we moved to have them removed, and that was a successful motion. But I'd be willing to listen to your perspective, and if you could, at the same time, identify how many you could fit on Quincy Street and your rationale as to why it's important to have them there now. Alderman Dowd.
When we addressed the issue on Quincy Street, was not part of that regarding the postal workers?
It was postal, it was VFW.
I'm sure.
Yes, there were several different issues that we spoke about at that particular point in time.
Okay.
And now we've got the soup kitchen there. Director Cummings.
And so what you have is essentially one vehicle that sits for 8 hours, and you don't get the turnover, and that is essentially causing a pile-on effect. And I think if we were, and I don't think we need to go as far or as aggressively as suggesting meters, but I was surprised not to see a 2-hour type of regulation in place along there to start getting that turnover necessary, which would make it better for the courthouse, for the post office, and for some of those nonprofits on East Pearl
Depends on how
Street.
long your court hearing is.
That's right. Depends on how long your court hearing is.
Because otherwise, you could be in a court hearing for 4 hours and
Right.
you'll have a nice ticket waiting for you on your way out.
Right, that's true. That's true.
Alderman Lopez.
My ability to see meters is being challenged a little bit here, but I
Oh.
also think I know that street pretty well. And the courthouse doesn't usually overflow in that direction. If there is people parking right in front of it, it's typically police officers dropping off or picking up, and that's in the controlled metered section. On Quincy Street, my recollection from like this morning and yesterday is people move their cars a lot because a lot of them are there for the soup kitchen. They're picking up food and then they're driving off, and there's a lot of turnover there. I don't think there's cars parked on Quincy Street for 8 hours. I know that the space across from where the post office parking lot ends, they use that to turn their trucks around, so you really can't put any spaces there because they can't move large vehicles around it. So I don't think metered parking's a possibility. I think the 2-hour limit, you could put it on there. I'm sure the neighbors would love it if somebody's parking there, but I don't think people park there for 2 hours. I think anybody who is a volunteer or a disabled guest at the soup kitchen is parking in the soup kitchen's lot. I think their staff is parking behind the parking authority or the housing authority, and I don't see the courthouse overflow that often.
I would, let me just add one thing, is I believe with the beautiful mural that's being painted right there, right now, I think we're going to have a lot of people that are just going to sit there and enjoy it.
They're gonna get run over by a tractor trailer.
Director Cummings.
I guess my only question would be then, if there is that turnover on Quincy Street, why bridges wouldn't make themselves available to that? So that would be very close parking for them, which would not necessitate the need for removal of the meters on East Pearl Street.
Well, so
Can I speak to that?
come back to us with a recommendation. Check out Quincy Street. Let us know how many stalls and what the recommendation would be. I'm not interested in meters there, but something to turn over, and that may be of help. Alderman Lopez?
I
didn't mean to
just,
cut
I
you
just
off.
want to reiterate that someone who's been through a traumatic and abusive incident, who is going to a bunch of strangers to explain it, they don't want to walk past a soup kitchen full of people or the old, like the 23 Temple Street. That's why that spot would be ideal for them. It's because they can park, go in and out, and get their thing done in a discreet manner. I kind of feel like this discussion is leading towards suggesting they should be walking all over the place when they're particularly anxious. And that was basically the genesis of my motion here, is that in discussing it with Bridges and the different challenges that they have, it is very uncomfortable for people to go there and seek help the first and second time. And even having to cross the street or not knowing which house is theirs or looking for the quarter, any number of those things can discourage somebody who's in an anxious state.
We appreciate that and we sympathize. I think what we're suggesting right now is just some more information. And we will certainly take up your concerns as we have additional data points to look at.
Appreciate that.
Alderman Dowd.
I could be wrong, but isn't there parking spaces behind that location? It looked like there were 4 or 5 cars there and a driveway.
Yes.
Aren't those parking spaces back there for that building?
I don't know if it's for that building or not, but I do know that if someone's looking up the address for Bridges to go, and there's a parking space right in front, it's much easier and simpler for them to get into and out of with kids, with their belongings, with whatever barriers they might have, than trying to figure out where a driveway is or getting into it and finding out that it's full or whatever other circumstance they have to do.
But again, my concern is if you take the meter away from there or you don't limit the parking, somebody's gonna park there all day.
Right.
And then it won't be available.
So can we understand what parking is available and who utilizes around the building?
Yes.
And I honestly sympathize with Alderman Lopez and the points that he makes as far as feeling comfortable coming in and coming out. If I knew where the building was and if I knew where I needed to go, I think that it's just my opinion, Alderman Lopez. So I think it would be easier to enter and exit the building, not from the street. But that's just my perspective. So if there's parking that's available in the back, it might be a win-win for everybody involved. And I don't know if there is enough parking in the back. So let's just find that out.
Well, just as another possibility, if we remove the parking meter and made it 2-hour parking, wouldn't it be the same controls that are being suggested around the corner?
Yes. It would. Alderman Dowd.
You've been hinting towards getting more information from Director Vale. I
Not
already
yet.
downplayed it to the one level. Director Cummings. Do we want to table this to our next meeting until we get information back from Director Cummings?
I think it depends on the will of the committee. I
I'll make-
would, as chair, I would be interested in some additional information, but
I'll
if,
make a motion to table to the next meeting.
okay. So Alderman Dowd is motioning to table until the next meeting to a date certain. All those in favor say aye.
All right?
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. All right. So that will be tabled until our next meeting. Do we have to take anything from the table this evening? Are we taking Ash Street, overnight on-street parking for a portion of Ash Street? I don't think so. All right, general discussion, gentlemen? Alderman Shoneman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I like the progress that we're making. I know it's taken a while to do the overnight parking, but it's good progress, and I think we're coming up with a good plan. And I think it addresses a lot of folks' needs. So even though we hash through a lot and it takes the time, I think that it's good to spend the time and to do the hashing that we have to do. So thank those that contributed so much.
Thank you, Alderman Shoneman. Alderman Dowd?
Yeah, I just want to say to Director Cummings and Mr. Veo that I know you have a million things on your plate, and I don't know how you balance them all. So appreciate all that's going into it. And I can see how you have concern about finishing this up because it's one of many things going on. So thank you for all your work in this area.
Any additional comments, general discussion? Director Cummings, I mentioned this last night at the full board, and you weren't there, so I wanted to express it to you this evening, is I appreciate the effort that you took to coordinate and guide and bring multiple individuals and groups through Daniel Webster College over the last several weeks. I think each tour that we took was more interesting, and we started to get into the details. We understood what people were asking, and we actually became prepared to answer those responses. How much square footage is the top floor of the admin building at 20 University Drive, and how much, and we started anticipating these questions. And so I believe that it was a worthwhile endeavor, and that I truly appreciate the time and effort that you put into scheduling, coordinating, and making sure that somebody was there to greet us and walk us through. And then, I know, again, that was an hour out of your day to do that for us. And I know there are a lot of other things that you're working on. So it was much appreciated, and thank you for that. Public comment? I don't see anybody from the public that would care to speak this evening. Any additional remarks by Alderman? Alderman Lopez.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the public candidate forum that they had tonight. I had to make a choice, as did you, Alderman Cookson, but it's a great activity to have. It's great to engage the public in that, because the whole concept of having a democracy isn't, first of all, to have only one choice, but second of all, to be able to make an informed choice. So I appreciated having those kind of events because it lets the public come out and engage the candidates. It forces the candidates to make their positions clear and, talk about themselves and what their positions are, so that the public can make that opinion. So I just wanted to express that. I also want to remind anybody who's watching that the New England Roots Festival is on Saturday, downtown Nashua. There's going to be performances all day, free to the public. They will be closing down Main Street, so you might want to plan around that. But they're picking some really good music acts. And then tomorrow is the Veterans Stand Down at 45 High Street from 9 to 12 or 9 to 2. And it's a great opportunity for anybody who's out there who needs to connect with services, or anybody who knows somebody who should, to bring them down and find out what's available, because everybody who's supportive of veterans in the different service areas are in the same room, so you don't have to go on a scavenger hunt or anything.
Thank you, Alderman Lopez. Any additional remarks by Alderman? No need to go into non-public this evening. Is there a motion? Alderman Dowd.
Motion to adjourn?
The motion by Alderman Dowd is to adjourn. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, nay. We are adjourned at 9:10 PM.